here on Open Line with Dr. Thomas Schwartz, Professor of International Policy at Vanderbilt University. Thanks so much for joining us. We had some excellent questions earlier in the show. We want to remind people to please go ahead, give us a call. We want to hear from you. That number is 615-737-7587, 737+. That's the number. So, you know, we were just talking about what's happening between Ukraine and Russia right now, but I want to talk about the support that Russia is receiving right now. Talk to me about Iran.
Well, Iran has been providing Russia with drones to attack Ukrainian targets, and this has been a very effective method for attack. And the fact that the Iranians are doing it, then denied doing it, and then the evidence is pretty overwhelming is interesting. In that sense, there is this sort of connection between Russia and Iran in the sense that both countries, in a way, as dictatorships, feel themselves threatened by the West and are willing in that sense to cooperate, even though oftentimes they have very little in common on other issues.
How strong is the relationship? I mean, can Iran be swayed?
I doubt it. I think Iran's central enemy is the United States, and as long as Putin's central enemy is the United States and NATO, they have a marriage of convenience that's pretty effective and pretty strong. They first got together, in a sense, in the support for the Syrian government during the Syrian civil war, and they succeeded in that. Russia helped Iran and Syria maintain that regime in power, and in this sense, there's almost a continuation. This is, in a way, what you have in the world is an anti-Western alliance among certain countries. Russia and Iran are certainly there. To a certain extent, North Korea is part of it. North Korea has supposedly provided some aid to Russia as well. And these are countries that feel themselves threatened by the Western order, by democracy, by the principles that an alliance like NATO is set upon. And they are determined to upset that order and prevent it from affecting them.
Earlier we were talking about, you know, why don't other countries get involved? And, you know, there's that sort of great overarching concern about a nuclear threat.
Right.
If it came to that worst case scenario, would Iran want to sort of play in that playground?
Well, Iran is itself developing a nuclear threat. This has been, of course, the issue of the Iranian nuclear agreement that President Obama negotiated, that President Trump left, and that President Biden has been seeking to renegotiate. So Iran's nuclear policies during this entire time, it's moving closer to having a weapon. So in effect, while it would probably not want to see any type of nuclear war break out near its borders, its cooperation with Russia can probably enhance it's taken Russia out of the alliance of countries that were trying to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. In that sense, it's a benefit for them. Interesting.
Well, talk to me about the unrest that's happening in Iran right now, particularly over women's rights.
Yes, yeah, it's absolutely both fascinating and horribly sad. You know, a young woman was killed or is suspected to have been killed by security forces for improperly wearing her hijab. That led to simply a huge number of protests by women, but also by men who also sympathize strongly with them. Today we know that, for example, the Iranian soccer team at the World Cup demonstrated in solidarity with women in Iran. The sad thing is that Iran is largely closed off to a lot of Western media. The regime is absolutely determined to crush this dissent and is now trying people and prepared to use the death penalty. Iran executes more people in the world per capita than any other country, and it's continuing in that manner. So as long as the regime is able to hold on to its military props, its Revolutionary Guard, and it's willing to kill in order to stay in power, it probably will. And the protests may continue, and they're extraordinarily courageous people, but right now they are still in power.
Yeah, and you mentioned the regime is determined to crush dissent. Is this protest, obviously the country has seen many protests historically, is this one any different?
There are some indications of a difference in the sense that it seems to be more widespread. The fact that Iran is a fairly youthful country, that its population is younger than many other countries, means that there are a lot of people, especially young people, who are frustrated with the regime's restrictions on their lives. Social media has played a role. What's difficult, Iran had a revolution in 1979, but that revolution had leadership. It had leadership from Ayatollah Khomeini, who was based in France and then was able to come to Iran. This revolution still is leaderless. It's spontaneous, it's certainly courageous, but there hasn't emerged a structure that might give it the potential to really affect and overthrow the regime. And what you're probably going to see is just ongoing repression, the regime just crushing dissent, crushing various movements in different parts of the country as it goes along. As long as the military remains loyal and is willing to enforce the regime's rules, the regime will stay in power. Now there have been some indications, for example, of protests at the oil production and in other parts of the economy, and that could have an effect. That's something that happened back in 1979. But I'm afraid I'm fairly pessimistic about the possibility that the regime will really be changed.
Yeah. What do you think it is about the protests or the uprising that this time, for whatever reason, there is no perhaps singular leadership, maybe not as organized as in protests past? Is it because it's just so difficult under the regime?
Yes.
Is it because people are in fear of their life and no one wants to sort of stick their head out there? What do you think it is?
People are very courageous. It's just that the regime makes it very hard for people to organize in any effective manner. As long as it's able to control the larger elements of the social media, the internet, and as long as it's able to prevent groups from in some ways creating alliances and coordinating their actions, it should be able to just crush the various different sections of the wherever there's protest. And as courageous as people are, the futility, if you feel like you're going to, you might want to sacrifice your life, but feel like that there's no hope. Very few people are usually willing to make that sort of gesture. As courageous as people are, they have to have a sense that there's going to be some success, and right now I don't see that as likely. I hope I'm wrong. And in 1979 we did see it happen, and a lot of people never expected it then. They thought the Shah's regime was very strong, but once the military started to crumble, the regime came down very quickly, and the same thing could happen if that were to happen in Iran.
So here's a big question for you. What would it take for the military to crumble?
I think some degree of disaffection among military leaders that's communicated to troops that gives them the right then to say, we're not going to fire on crowds, we're not going to shoot people who are protesting. Once that happens, then there's a sort of it could be almost a domino effect of the military not acting, and then it could go back into the it could unravel the methods of repression that the regime has used.
But no indications that that's going to happen?
No indications yet that that's going to happen.
Talk to me about what's at risk for protesters. I mean, we're hearing about these horrible atrocities that are happening, especially to women who are taken under arrest by, this morality police.
Yeah, and that's, again, repression, I think we like in the West to believe that repression is not an answer, and that it leads to more spontaneous reaction and violence, but that's not necessarily what the rest of the world is used to. In fact, repression can often work, and especially if there does not seem to be hope. Now, to a certain extent, some of the things the West has been trying to do, for example, to give greater internet access, to loosen up rules that were restricting high-tech companies from allowing people to communicate with their various technical devices, apps, and the rest. That's a good sign. I mean, the rest of the world can, in a way, put pressure in some ways on Iran, but I think Iran is closed off enough and dominated enough by this the theocratic leadership that it's hard to, and it's so sanctioned already that it's hard to come up with new devices to deny it things that would actually affect or hurt the regime.
Yeah. A reminder to give us a call here on Open Line. I know that Dr. Schwartz is eager to answer your questions. That number to give us a call, 615-737-7587. Dr. Schwartz, I want to ask you about the role Turkey has in all of this. Talk to me about that.
Well, Turkey is an interesting case. It is still technically a democratic state in the sense that there are elections and there are still active political parties. But President Erdogan has been imprisoning journalists. He's been repressing the Kurds, who are the largest minority group that have been. He's authorized military attacks on Kurdish separatists in various areas. Turkey could play a leadership role, but under President Erdogan, he has largely been more concerned with making sure his own power is intact, and putting out dissent and essentially pushing down opportunities to protest against his regime. So, in a way, although Turkey is an ambiguous case because it is linked to the Western economies, its currency floats. It has it's a major trading partner with a lot of these countries. Erdogan is an authoritarian. He does not brook much dissent in his party or in his country as a whole, and because of that, its actual influence, I think, is more limited.
Yeah, and I know we just saw those airstrikes in Syria and Iraq.
That's right.
What does that say to you?
What it says is that he feels that he can act militarily now in places that were, especially in Iraq, where America had strong interests. We have our relationship with our Kurdish allies in Iraq, the section of Iraq, are very strong, but Erdogan feels that he can act against it because there's relatively little we can really do about it. Syria is, of course, a different case because Syria is still recovering from the civil war, and so striking at the Kurds there, even though, again, the United States has a role and has been allied with those Kurds, is also a defiance toward the United States and toward NATO and toward America's role in that region.
I know we could keep going, but we have to quickly toss to a commercial break. We'll be back here on Open Line with Dr. Thomas Schwartz after this.